I need to stop and think about this for a second, because what I'm about to tell you, it still doesn't feel real, even now. For 31 years, I worked as a forensic accountant for the federal government. Not the kind of job you see on TV. No guns, no car chases. Just numbers, spreadsheets, paper trails. I was the guy who sat in a windowless room and followed the money until it told me who was lying. I testified in court more times than I can count. I helped put away embezzlers, tax cheats, a congressman who thought he was clever. I retired at 62 with a commendation letter and a bad left knee from too many years hunched over a desk. I thought I was done with all of that. I thought the hardest thing I'd ever face in my life was already behind me. I was wrong. My wife and I had been married for 34 years when I first noticed the change. Her name was Sylvia. I'll call her that here because that's her name, and I'm too old to start using code words for the woman who shared my bed for 3 decades. We met in our late 20s, married at 29. Raised 2 kids in the same house in Raleigh, North Carolina. A house we'd bought young and paid off by the time our daughter finished college. We had a good life. Quiet, stable, the kind of life most people say they want and then feel vaguely disappointed by once they have it. Sylvia had always been the social one. I was the numbers guy. She was the one who remembered our neighbors' birthdays and organized the block party every 4th of July and kept a running list of everyone who'd ever done us a favor so she could return it someday. That was her nature. Generous, warm, a little scattered, but in an endearing way. So when she started taking long lunches twice a week and coming home quieter than usual, I told myself it was nothing. She'd joined a book club the previous spring. She had her yoga class on Tuesdays. She had a whole life that didn't involve me, and I'd always respected that about her. But there are things you notice after 34 years. Small things. The way she'd leave the room to take a phone call when she'd never done that before. The way she'd get up earlier than usual and sit at the kitchen table just staring out the window with her coffee going cold. The way she said my name differently, carefully, like she was measuring it. I didn't say anything for about 2 months. I'm not a confrontational person by nature. That probably surprises people when they hear what I used to do for a living, but it's true. In my work, I never confronted anyone. I just gathered information until the information was undeniable. Then I handed it to the people whose job it was to act on it. The problem, I was about to learn, was that I had no one to hand this particular folder to. It was a Thursday in late October when I found the first thing. I wasn't snooping, or at least I wasn't snooping with any particular suspicion. I was looking for the insurance documents for our car, which Sylvia kept in a filing cabinet in the spare bedroom she used as an office. I went through the drawer marked insurance and found the car documents. I also found, tucked behind them in a manila envelope, a set of bank statements for an account I had never seen before. The account was in her name only. It had been opened 14 months earlier. And over those 14 months, our joint savings account had been sending regular transfers to it. Small ones, $200 here, $300 there, in a pattern that was designed, I could see immediately, to stay below the threshold that would trigger any kind of automatic alert. I'm a forensic accountant. I know what structuring looks like. What I was looking at was structuring. I put the documents back, exactly as I'd found them. I took a photo of each page with my phone. I went downstairs and started dinner, and when Sylvia came home, I kissed her on the cheek and asked how her day was. She said it was fine. I said that was good. We ate pasta. I didn't sleep that night. I want to be clear about what I was feeling at this point. It wasn't rage. It wasn't even grief. It was something colder than either of those things. The same feeling I used to get in my early years on the job when a document I was reviewing suddenly revealed something that shouldn't have been there. A kind of stillness. A settling. Like some part of my brain had been waiting for confirmation of something it already suspected, and now that the confirmation had arrived, it could finally get to work. Over the next 3 weeks I went through everything. Not in a frantic way. Methodically. I'm not capable of doing it any other way. I made a spreadsheet. Of course I made a spreadsheet. I documented every withdrawal from our joint account going back 2 years. I documented every wire transfer, every check, every cash advance on the credit card she used for groceries. And what I found, when I laid it all out in order, was a picture that took my breath away. The transfers to her private account totaled just over $41,000. $41,000, moved carefully in fragments over 14 months from the account we'd spent 30 years building together. But that wasn't the worst of it. What was worse, significantly worse, was what I found when I started looking at where the money in her private account was going. It was going to a company called Harborstone Consulting Group, LLC. I'd never heard of it. Sylvia had never mentioned it. There was no reason our money should have been going anywhere near it. I ran the company registration. It had been incorporated 18 months earlier in Delaware, a very common choice for entities that want maximum privacy, with a registered agent that was itself a registered agent company, which tells you nothing about who actually owns the business. The listed manager was a man named Theodore Wainwright. I didn't know anyone named Theodore Wainwright. I ran the name. Not illegally, I still have professional contacts, and there are public databases I know how to use. Theodore Wainwright, age 41, had a LinkedIn profile describing him as a private wealth consultant and entrepreneur. He had a business address in Charlotte, about 2.5 hours from our house. He had a photograph that showed a good-looking man in an expensive suit, smiling the kind of smile that takes practice. He had, I soon discovered, a history. Not a criminal history, not on paper. But I found 3 different online forums over the course of 2 evenings where women, and it was always women, and they were always within a certain age range, and they had all met him through the same channels, described variations of the same experience. He was charming, he was attentive, he made you feel special. He talked about investment opportunities with impressive fluency, and then, slowly, he began asking for money, not demanding it, suggesting it, framing it as an opportunity, a favor to her, a chance to get in on something before the window closed. By the time they realized what was happening, the window had closed, just not in the way he'd described. I sat back in my chair and looked at what I'd assembled and thought about my wife. My wife of 34 years, who had apparently met this man, I still didn't know where or how, and had been feeding him our savings for over a year. I wondered if she knew what he was. I wondered if she was in love with him, or just under his spell, or some combination of the two that made the distinction meaningless. I wondered if she'd thought about what would happen when I found out, or if she'd simply convinced herself I wouldn't. I'd spent 31 years finding things. Of all the people in the world to try to hide something from. The following Saturday, she told me she was going to Charlotte for a spa weekend with a friend from her yoga class. She'd mentioned this friend before. I'll call her the friend, because I have no quarrel with her, and it turned out she existed and genuinely believed Sylvia was meeting her for something else. Sylvia had been using her as cover. I knew she wasn't going to any spa. I booked a room at a hotel in Charlotte under a pretext that doesn't matter. I drove down that Friday evening, and on Saturday afternoon, I sat in a coffee shop across the street from the building where Harborstone Consulting Group LLC maintained its suite of offices, with a cup of coffee and a newspaper I wasn't reading, and I waited. She arrived at 2:15. I watched her walk across the parking lot. She was dressed more carefully than she dressed for me. I noticed that. I noticed it and filed it away in the part of my mind where I was keeping all the things I wasn't letting myself feel yet. He came out to meet her, Theodore Wainwright, taller than his photos suggested. The suit was there, so was the smile. I watched them go inside. I finished my coffee. I drove back to my hotel. I want to explain why I didn't go over there, why I didn't walk across that street and knock on that door and demand an accounting, in every sense of the word. I've thought about it since. I think the honest answer is that I knew, from 31 years of professional experience, that confrontation at the wrong moment destroys cases. If I walked in there and made a scene, 2 things would happen. 1, they would both know that I knew. 2, anything I might want to do legally, and I was already thinking about legal options, would become infinitely more complicated. Emotional confrontations leave witnesses, produce conflicting accounts, give the other side time to prepare. I drove back home on Sunday. Sylvia came home Sunday evening with a tote bag from a spa she hadn't been to and talked about the treatments in the heated pool, and I listened and said, "That sounded lovely," and asked if she wanted tea. She said yes. I made the tea, and on Monday morning I called my attorney. My attorney has been my attorney for 19 years. He's the kind of man who doesn't raise his voice, and doesn't waste words, and doesn't tell you things are fine when they aren't. I laid out everything I had, the account statements, the transfer history, the company registration, the forums, the photographs I'd taken from a public street, and I watched him read through it in silence. When he finished, he looked up and said, "How long have you known?" I said, "About a month." He nodded slowly. "You understand what Harborstone is?" "I have a theory," I said. I want to hear yours. He said what I already knew, stated more precisely. Theodore Wainwright appeared to be running a variant of the romance-adjacent investment scam, not a pure romance scam, because he was careful to maintain some genuine-seeming business framework, but a scheme that targeted women in a certain demographic and leveraged emotional attachment to extract funds. The investment opportunities he described were either fictional or structured so that any returns would be swallowed by fees he controlled. The 41,000, I said. Is that recoverable? Possibly some of it, he said. It depends on how quickly we move, and whether there are other victims filing simultaneously, and whether state authorities have already opened a file on him. Have they? He made a phone call while I was sitting there. It took about 8 minutes. When he hung up, he said that there was, in fact, an active investigation. Theodore Wainwright had been on the radar of the North Carolina Attorney General's office for approximately 6 months. My documentation, my attorney said, was significantly more organized than what they currently had. I told him to share everything. Now I had to deal with my marriage. I want to say something here about the conversation I had with my wife, because I've seen the way these things get depicted in movies and in stories people tell, and it's usually either a screaming match, or a tearful breakdown, or some dramatic confrontation with things getting thrown. That's not what happened in our kitchen on a Tuesday evening in November. I asked her to sit down. She sat. I put the stack of bank statements on the table between us. I watched her face. She didn't say anything for a long time. Then she said, "How long have you known?" The same question my attorney had asked. "Long enough," I said. She started to cry. I handed her a paper towel, we were out of tissues, and waited. What she told me over the next 2 hours was this. She had met Theodore Wainwright through an online investment group that a woman from her book club had shared with her. In the beginning, it was just information, newsletters, webinars, that kind of thing. Then he had reached out to her personally. He was attentive. He remembered things she said. He made her feel, she told me, like someone was paying attention to her. I heard that, and I sat with it. I said, "Was I not paying attention to you?" She said it wasn't that. She said she didn't know how to explain it. She said he had a way of making her feel like the most important person in a room, and she knew it was probably calculated. She knew that now, but at the time she had let herself believe it was real. I asked her directly whether there had been a physical relationship. She said yes. Twice, she said. Both times in Charlotte. I nodded. I got up and poured myself a glass of water. I stood at the sink for a moment, looking out the window at our backyard, where I had pushed 2 children on a rope swing, and barbecued 400 meals, and grown a garden that had progressively gotten better every year, until it was something I was genuinely proud of. I turned around and told her I wanted her to move in with her sister for a while. She asked if this was permanent. I said I didn't know yet. She left 3 days later. I helped her carry her bags to her car. I'm not sure either of us knew what to do with that. The 34 years of reflex that made us just automatically do things together. In January, the North Carolina Attorney General's office announced charges against Theodore Wainwright. 11 counts total, including wire fraud, securities fraud, and multiple charges related to operating an unlicensed investment scheme. There were 7 other victims that had come forward. My documentation was cited in the indictment as foundational evidence. My attorney called to tell me. I was sitting on the back porch with a cup of coffee when he called, looking at the garden I'd have to put to bed again in the spring. I thanked him. He said he'd keep me updated. I went inside and called my daughter. She's 31, my daughter. She lives in Portland with her husband and my 2 grandchildren, and she has her mother's warmth and, I'm told, my stubbornness, which I consider both a blessing and a liability in equal measure. She had known something was wrong since Thanksgiving, when Sylvia and I had sat at the same table with our son, and his wife, and the grandchildren, and performed the careful pantomime of a marriage that was no longer sure what it was. I told her everything. I'd been waiting until there was something concrete to tell. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Dad, are you okay?" I told her I was managing. "That's not what I asked," she said. She's right. I wasn't okay. I want to be honest about that because the story I just told you has a kind of clean professional logic to it. The investigation, the documentation, the indictment, and I don't want that to obscure the fact that behind all of it was a man who came home every night for a year to a house where his wife looked at him across the dinner table and said nothing about any of it. That's not a thing you process by making spreadsheets. I know. I tried. I went to see a therapist in February. I mention this not because it's anyone's business, but because I think it matters to say it, not as a dramatic detail, but as a practical fact. I am a 64-year-old man who spent 31 years in federal service, and I went and sat across from someone and talked about my feelings, and it helped. That's the whole statement. In March, Sylvia asked if we could meet for coffee. We met at a place near her sister's house. She looked tired. She had aged in the month since I'd seen her last. Or maybe I was just looking at her differently now. She told me that Theodore Wainwright had called her in January after the arrest. He had called to tell her that none of it was real, that she was foolish, that she should feel ashamed for believing him. She said he had done it, she thought, out of spite, because he was angry that the case had been built partly around her. She told me this flatly, without any particular drama, and I watched her face as she said it, and I thought, she's been carrying this for 2 months. I didn't say anything for a moment. Then I said, "Did you already know it wasn't real? Before he called?" She looked at the table. "Yes," she said. "I think I knew for a long time. I don't know if that made it better or worse. I've spent months thinking about it. I've decided it probably just made it more human, because I think most people who make a serious mistake don't make it in a burst of ignorance. They make it while knowing, somewhere underneath, that it's a mistake. They just choose, for a while, not to look." The divorce was finalized in June. It was uncomplicated, legally speaking. We had an estate attorney help us divide things equitably, and because neither of us wanted to fight, we didn't fight. The house went on the market in April and sold in 2 weeks. We split the proceeds. I bought a smaller place on the other side of Raleigh. I have a garden that's half the size of the old one, which means I actually have a chance of keeping up with it properly. I still have my daughter calling me every Sunday. My son calls less often, but when he does, he stays on the phone for 2 hours, which I've decided to count as a form of love. Of the $41,000, $36,000 was recovered as part of the restitution order in the Wainwright case. My attorney earned his retainer. I want to end with something that might surprise you, because I've been told this story sounds like it should end with anger. And I understand why. 34 years, $41,000. A man in Charlotte who made a career out of targeting people's loneliness. But here's what I actually feel, sitting on my back porch in Raleigh on a Sunday afternoon in October, with a cup of coffee in a garden that doesn't know or care about any of this. I feel like I know who I am, not in a dramatic way. Not in the way that means I've emerged transformed or enlightened, or any of the words people use when they want to make suffering sound like it was worth it. Just, I know what I'll do when something is wrong. I know I'll sit down quietly and follow the evidence until it tells me the truth. I know I can be hurt without becoming someone I don't recognize. I know that a marriage ending doesn't mean the whole account is a loss. I was a forensic accountant for 31 years. I know the difference between a transaction and a balance. The balance, for me, is still net positive, and I'm going to keep it that way.